You're listening to the Peace Corner. For more stories on peace and conflict, click subscribe. You can find us on iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, and more.
There are 1.8 billion people between the ages of 10 and 24. Imagine what a tremendous force for good they could be if we invested as much time, energy, and money in their education and development as we do in fighting wars.
Today, with more than 1 billion people aged from 15 to 24, we are witnessing the largest youth population the world has ever known. Unfortunately, a large proportion of them live in fragile and conflict-affected areas where high levels of violence threaten their existence and futures. While there are many young peacebuilders trying to make a change, they are still often regarded as either perpetrators or victims of violence. Despite all this, the field of peacebuilding is still dominated by older men in suits. How can we challenge that status quo and create space for youth at the peace table? To find out, we sat down with Gizem Kilinç, the leading coordinator of the United Networks of Young Peacebuilders. So hi all, welcome to the Peace Corner podcast. Today we will be talking about youth activism in peacebuilding. We're going to discuss these issues today with Gizem, who is the leading coordinator of UNOY, which is United Network of Young Peacebuilders, the international network that has a secretariat here in The Hague. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Theodora. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Gizem Kilinç and I'm very happy to be part of this podcast.
So first, I would like to talk a bit about yourself. Can you tell us where you're from and how did you come to the peacebuilding?
Of course. So yes, I've already said my name. I was born and raised in Rotterdam, which is a little city in the Netherlands, a port town. And I own 2 bikes. I have 1 bike in Rotterdam. And then I take the train here to The Hague, where I work at the office of the United Network of Young Peacebuilders. So I have another bike over here. So that's very, very Dutch of me. But I also have a link, despite being born in the lowlands of the Netherlands, I also have a link with the mountainous region in the eastern part of Turkey, where my parents and my sister were born, and who, as a family, sought refuge from an armed conflict in the region, which has fascinated me growing up, their family history, why did they have to flee this region, and it also formed my decision to study conflict and how it can be resolved in a peaceful way. So that's a bit the link to my studies, and eventually I rolled into an internship. Like you, Theodora, I also was interning with GPPAC some couple of years ago, and I kept coming back for a new assignment because it was just such an exciting network to be part of and to serve as well. And that's, I guess the first steps I have taken into this path of peace building and conflict prevention.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's really interesting. But what inspired you to work specifically for youth activism inside the peace building field?
Yeah. It's a good question. So I was looking for ways to continue focusing on peace and security issues. I had noticed also in my previous experiences working for a network of civil society organizations focusing on peace building, I had found myself sometimes in these high-level events, and I'm using quotation marks here, where I was surrounded by officials and representatives of certain governmental bodies or intergovernmental bodies or very well recognized established civil society organizations. And I felt that my presence there was questioned, my role, my contributions, and I would sometimes get unsolicited career advice, or people would say things like, oh, it must be so exciting for you to take up all of these discussions and take them in when I was, for instance, supporting the organization of the event. And I felt that, sometimes the conversations, or that I had to kind of defend the right to be there, that I could also make meaningful contributions on content. This was not always the case. But I think also maybe being a young woman, with my voice not carrying terribly far and being 160 meters, maybe that also kind of reinforces the way that I'm sometimes perceived in these spaces. So that's, I guess, has informed my youth identity a bit, and made me realize that young people are viewed very differently when it comes to peace and security issues. They're often seen as the perpetrator And this is often gendered as well, seeing young men as the perpetrators in conflict and young women as the victims, the helpless victims that need to be protected. So this stereotypes, they became more and more clear to me, especially having joined UNOY, the network, which is not only a network of youth activists, but it's a network of experts. A lot of the work does happen through movements or through mobilizing other young people, but it's also very serious. A lot of young people have set up organizations or are trying to influence policies within their countries. So I think it also goes beyond activism.
Yeah, so you were mentioning your organization, so can you tell us about how it was established and what is it trying to achieve?
Of course. So a fun fact, me and the United Network of Young Peacebuilders, in short, UNOY, we were both born in the same year, in 1989, and we're turning both 30 this year. We're only 20 days apart, our birthdays. And it was, interestingly enough, founded by a Russian UN diplomat. He had a dream, also on his birthday. There's a lot of birthdays in this story. He was turning 50, and he had a dream where he thought of the UN, or he saw the UN General Assembly Hall filled with young people discussing contemporary issues, and woke up and tried to find other like-minded people who wanted to bring this vision to life. So initially, UNOY was created as the United Nations of Youth in 1989. It kind of grew into this loose network of young people concerned with different issues, from environment to peace building being one of them, intercultural dialogue, quite a wide range of issues that they wanted to work together to resolve or to address somehow. And then this network transformed into more of a formal network, a network of youth organizations with this very targeted focus on peace building and conflict prevention. There was a conference in the early 2000s in the Peace Palace, which I can view here from this room, and the success and the level of discussions in that conference also led people to think, to decide that it was time to really have this targeted focus on peace building, because it was such a, there was no other network or platform where young people could meet to focus on peace and security issues and develop joint approaches for shared challenges. And then what happened, we changed our name to the United Network of Young Peacebuilders in 2003. And then we had our first paid staff in 2006. Up until then, it was really driven by volunteers and interns. And and now we're going into a new phase that I can tell you perhaps a little later a bit more about.
Okay, so you mentioned that it's 30th anniversary this year.
Yep.
Can you maybe tell what are you personally very proud of what the organization already has achieved till this point?
Yeah, I think there's quite a few things to choose from. There's, of course, personal, maybe the more kind of smaller scale connections or changes that I see that our network brings about. But globally, one thing that I'm very, 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 very proud of that we have achieved as a global coalition of young peacebuilders around the world is that we were able, that we looked at policy discussions, we looked at how the media has portrayed us, and we felt that this was not very much in line with all the examples of young people who are organizing themselves in their communities at the national level, whether they are focusing on gender-based violence or forms of or economic empowerment or community-based dialogue. We saw so many examples of how young people have a lot of energy, a lot of motivation, a lot of commitment to bring about changes. But this was not echoed at the policy level. So we were very much inspired by the women peacebuilding movement, which had managed to put into place a policy framework supporting their efforts within civil society. And we, since 2008, 9, we have gone off to the UN headquarters in New York, and spoke to decision makers, whether they're part of member states within the permanent representations to the UN or different agencies and departments within the UN, tried to bring about this conversation about how we would like young people to be viewed when it comes to peace building, and what type of support would we need to scale up the already existing efforts. Initially, some policymakers, decision makers that we spoke with were a bit skeptical. We had responses from one member state that who will remain anonymous, who said, "Your grandchildren will not even see this resolution," because we were aiming for a UN Security Council resolution, so a thematic resolution on youth, peace, and security. And yeah, some people were thinking, well, maybe that's too ambitious. Maybe you should aim more for the UN General Assembly, which is not the highest political authority on peace and security. But we remained very persistent. We also, over time, developed great friendships and partnerships with people within the UN system, within bigger international NGOs that could help us also be more strategic. In 2015, by surprise, because it didn't even take that long, the Jordanian government, which was part of the UN Security Council at the time, put forward a declaration called the Amman Youth Declaration, which was informed by tens of thousands of youth voices, because there was a global summit on youth, peace, and security in Jordan a few months before December 2015. Brought the declaration to the UN Security Council and said, we are sponsoring a resolution, which was eventually anonymously adopted by the UN Security Council. So that's, I think, one big achievement. Why is it so important? It didn't come from within the UN. It's really a civil society-driven process. Even the parts of the resolution, they have been informed directly by young people, because it's heavily inspired by the Amman Declaration, which has been co-authored by young people themselves. So I think that we were able to bring about this change in this very complex system that is sometimes a bit frustrating to work with. I think that's really one key achievement. And the thing is, it's not just has not remained a paper in the ivory tower of the UN. We're seeing a lot of changes following from it, and it is supporting, to an extent, the work of grassroots youth peace activists on the ground, which is the ultimate aim, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, so as you're talking now about UN Security Council Resolution 2250, maybe you can tell to people who haven't read the document maybe more about it.
Yeah, of course. So it's, I mean, if you look at it, it doesn't look very exciting. It's the UN template, some text in this very restricted format. But if you really dissect the wording, and if you really look at the principles and the spirit of the document, it is very exciting. It is very groundbreaking. As I mentioned, it came about from young people themselves, and there's 5 core pillars. It's a very comprehensive agenda. So there is the principle of participation, both political participation of young people, that UN member states, intergovernmental bodies, and all other relevant stakeholders must support youth participation in decision making at all levels, especially when it comes to peace and security issues, and also when it comes to peace processes, so really national dialogues and political dialogues. Then there is the principle of protection, which looks at issues of gender-based violence, that young people, like any other civilian in times of armed conflict, must be protected, that their civic space must also be protected, so they can organize themselves and express, have the freedom of assembly and expression and voice their opinions. The third pillar looks at partnerships, which is how the resolution came about. It is through partnerships with governmental bodies, with NGOs, with security sector actors, that no single actor can bring about peace. We know this. GPPAC also carries forward this message. And we also need similar types of partnerships to operationalize the youth peace and security agenda. There is prevention, which is also really the core principle or the core element of the youth peace and security agenda. A lot of through research that UNOY conducted in 2016, we found out that a lot of youth-led peacebuilding activities, it's of preventative action. It's not only looking at intervening once the conflict has escalated it into a full-blown war, but it's also about working in schools, working with families, thinking about narratives, certain public narratives, issues around economic empowerment, or having peace education integrated into national curricula. So these types of interventions that are also very important and should be supported as part of a prevention agenda. And then lastly, there is the pillar around disengagement and reintegration. We can't deny that a majority of young people in armed groups, in military, are young people, and once they're ready or have been disengaged from these groups, we also need to look very specifically at their needs and integrate that into existing DDR, disarmament, reintegration efforts. And and to really make sure that also their receiving communities are ready to that we can start bridging the trust gap that has come about as a result of the existing tensions between young people and their communities and their authorities. So that's that we also really need to look at specifically the needs of young people in these types of ongoing processes, also around security sector reform. And then the 2250 also called for a progress study, which is a bit of a misleading term because there hasn't really been any existing body of evidence around the contributions and the roles of young people when it comes to peace building. So the UN Secretary General had been mandated to carry out kind of a baseline study to understand where are young people in the world actively contributing to peace building and conflict prevention. What does their work look like? What are their challenges? How could we further harness, protect, and scale that type of work up? And that progress study has been completed last year. And I'm happy to tell you more about the findings if that's of interest.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
If you want to share with us, of course.
So there's so it was a very participatory research process informed by nearly 4,000 young people around the world. There was a lead author, Graham Simpson, who has consolidated all of the data that has come that we have collected through regional consultations, online consultations, focus group discussions, also trying to speak to young people that perhaps are that are, I don't want to use the word hard to reach, but that are less frequently consulted in these types of research. So young people in prisons or young people who are still active in rebel groups. So all this type of research happened. There were also a lot of civil society partners and UN partners that have also contributed thematic papers or looked at very specific parts, dimensions of the youth peace and security field as it's emerging. And and that has led to the independent progress study, which is titled The Missing Piece. And you can access it online in different languages, in the official UN languages. There's also an interactive website, and I would really recommend everyone to take a look at it because it's providing a roadmap for how 2250 can be implemented and looking at also some of the policy myths that have misguided programming on youth peace and security.
Okay, thank you. And it was adopted 4 years ago, the resolution.
Yeah.
What can you say already about the changes that came afterwards? Do you see any positive changes? Are people now more engaged in this topic?
Yeah, I guess this emerging knowledge base or the kind of the first steps is one key thing that we've managed to work towards. So, as I mentioned, after 2250 was adopted with my organization, with my colleagues from around the world, we would go to donors and say, now we want you to invest in the agenda, or now we want you to come up with strategies on how you're going to implement 2250, and then the answer would be, where's the evidence, where are the numbers, where are the statistics? So it was a crucial first next step to take after 2250 to gather this evidence. I mean, it can also become a bit of an excuse. Donors always want to see numbers and statistics. So at some point, it also needs to be time to take the next step. But in that sense, the progress study has provided us really interesting insights. Another development that I'm seeing is that tools, guidelines are being developed both within UNOY but also beyond that can help youth groups, but also other civil society organizations or civil society actors to zoom into some of the principles of 2250 and think, how can this inform my work, or what does this mean for my local community, and what type of action can we take as a basis. And we see a lot of youth groups. I'm quite active on social media. It's a good tool to monitor. I've seen a lot of youth groups that are not necessarily part of UNOY that have taken ownership of 2250, developing videos in their own local languages, events where they bring together different actors within their communities and are fully running with it. And that's really exciting to see that it's now spilling or trickling down into all these different layers and different types of actors. Another exciting development is also that a lot of regional intergovernmental bodies are realizing that they need to develop strategies, regional strategies, for the implementation of 2250. It's also maybe one way of reaching the member state level. There's a few governments, a few member states here and there, mostly in the global north, unfortunately, that are now developing or thinking of developing national action plans. Finland is the first one. It's exciting how they're approaching it, because they're not only looking at it as a foreign agenda, a foreign peace and security agenda, but also what does this mean for Finland and for Finnish youth. So it will also have this domestic angle to it. But still, it's been a bit challenging to broaden the ownership of 2250 beyond the Security Council to all of the member states of the UN. And so the regional intergovernmental bodies like the African Union, which is now conducting a research, developing a framework on youth peace and security, a regional one, or a Pan-African one rather, and the European Union, which has adopted policy guidance on youth peace and security, council conclusions in the form of council conclusions. It's really important movements to see, because as I mentioned, for now it's a global agenda, UN agenda, but it's not just a UN agenda. It needs to be, essentially it needs to change the lives of young people around the world. And I think the next step, these engagements at the regional level, are a very strategic one. And very, it's just very positive to see this. And they are partnering up with young Peacebuilders at the heart of all of these engagements.
So, as you said, it is indeed really exciting and positive to see all these changes, that young people are more willing to participate. But what are the main challenges for them
that they're still facing? I think their willingness was always there. It's not necessarily that young people are more willing. Maybe they're realizing that they have a role to play. Often when UNOY speaks to youth organizations, when we're saying, like, join our network, be part of it, sometimes the response we get is like, well, we're not sure if we're actually doing peacebuilding work. Peace and security, isn't that the domain of our government, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or as you said, old men in suits, and that we sometimes just have to, through conversations and finding out what the nature of the work actually is and the impact, that we have this collective realization that yes, we are a credible actor in this peacebuilding field. So I don't necessarily think it's always willingness of young people, but it's more maybe realizing and feeling empowered to have the agency, to be an agent in the peacebuilding field. But barriers that we still face, despite some of these very positive developments that I've shared, is the existing or persistent intergenerational trust gap. We see this between national governments, local authorities, and young people, and even international civil society organizations, but also the other way around, that young people still mistrust systems of patronage or corruption within their own national context, and that they do not necessarily want to be part of decision-making processes because they don't see those processes as legitimate, and they would rather create alternative spaces for participation, whether it's through their own civil society organizations or through perhaps more organic types of movements. So there's this trust gap that's still very much there, even though the perceptions are slowly changing of youth in global arenas. I'm not sure if the narrative is changing. The open debate in the UN Security Council in 2018, when the progress study was officially presented to the UN Security Council, there were 69 member states that said, "Oh, we welcome it, it's great, young people are agents of peace." But then their remarks still talked about violent extremism or youth migrating or young people not being employed, and that being a huge risk factor. So they might kind of on the surface are echoing some of the messages of 2250 and the progress study, but we're not quite sure if they mean it, if they're there yet. But I guess this is how you bring about shifts in any paradigm, and it starts with the words, then they start meaning it and understanding it truly. But that's still quite a barrier, I would say, which links me to some of the policies and the programs that both donors, intergovernmental institutions, and even civil society organizations have been developing as a response to this youth, peace, and security agenda. As I mentioned, a lot of it is still focusing on youth in violent extremism, even though we know that the majority of young people are not violent, and that it's a tiny minority that's part of violent extremist groups or adopts this type of thought. But yet, most of the funding, most of the policies are still geared towards these very restricted focuses on youth, peace, and security around violent extremism. So that's another very challenging issue. Related is also when we speak or when we're trying to create partnerships and work together with other actors, that there still seems to be this perception that education and employment is kind of the way forward, that by simply creating jobs or providing more education opportunities to young people, that's the way forward. But the progress study shows that it's not that simple, and it's not, especially not only if you focus on if you don't think of it in an integrated way, that actually the biggest challenge that young people face is their political exclusion or different forms of exclusion. And it's not only the matter of getting a job, but it's also about having a meaningful job that provides you social security. That it's much more, I guess, much more broader than simply creating jobs or building schools. Then a third challenge that I really that it's one that our members also frequently report to us as severely restricting their work, is the sense of civic space being narrowed, that governments, we just saw this recently in Zimbabwe with the tensions there, internet shutdown, or our members in certain countries not being able to receive funding from foreign sources, or their movement being restricted because their work is seen as opposing the status quo or the government, the positioning of the government, and could be perceived as terrorist. So we see a lot of these developments that restrict the space in which our member organizations can operate. Also, it targets individuals, and their personal securities is severely threatened. There's quite a few young Peacebuilders within our network who have repeatedly been arrested by their governments or local authorities without there being a clear kind of a process or how do you call it, like a claim towards this person, or a fair, or their passports being taken away from them, so they can't either move elsewhere to temporarily find support, or so yeah. There's a lot of these, and it's not just it's not only in, I don't know, the countries that we might think of when we think about restricted civic space. It's also issues that we see in in Europe, where we are here right now. There's member organizations that can receive funding within the different Council of Europe member states, and it's just really, really disheartening to see. And we're, as a global network, we're able to perhaps, especially when an individual is targeted, to work together with actors that we know at the international system, or I don't know, write letters to embassies, or ask our UN partners to come in and provide support, and create a lot of noise. But it's a really difficult development, and it's one to address.
And for young people who are interested in peace building, what advice do you have for them? Maybe something you like to share?
I might not want to give advice per se, because I think there are these young people that are either interested in peace building or are already active in one way or another. They probably have a lot of ideas and a lot of expertise themselves. What I would want to tell them is that if they want to be part of a network of like-minded people, if they want to tap into resources that our member organizations are openly sharing opportunities that we're co-creating, or want to be part of this this joint civil society voice towards different policymakers, and want to shape policies around peace and security, that they should definitely write to us, contact us, and get in touch with us, and also connect with member organizations in the countries where you might be present, because we are a network of organizations. So perhaps if you want, to be part of a group and to work with other like-minded people, definitely have a look at our website, get in touch with our regional coordinators, and they'll be able to link you up. I think that would be my main message to any young people that might be listening to this podcast and want to be part of this global network, this global movement of young Peacebuilders.
Thank you. And in the end, in this series of Peace Corner podcast, we have some questions that we would like to ask all our guests, and maybe to compare it. And so the first question would be, what is something you hope to see achieved in the world of peace building, globally or locally, within the next year?
I guess going back to maybe explaining a bit why I felt motivated and was very happy to join a network of young people working on peace building is I personally would find it great if in a 1 year time young people wouldn't have to be faced with the question of why is youth participation important in peace building, what is the impact, and that they wouldn't have to defend their right to participate. Again, it's a right, and that their agency wouldn't be questioned. I think that would be a great thing to see in the world if we could reach that point where it's common sense that young people should be part of any effort or intervention regarding conflict prevention and peace building. That would make me very happy if we would reach that.
Okay, and if you could debunk one myth or common misconception about peace building, what would that be?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think that it's not something fluffy, something only related to, inner peace and yoga and Ben & Jerry's, like all these symbols that we might associate with peace building that take away some of the political dimensions of peace building. As I mentioned, one of the greatest obstacles for young people to meaningfully contribute to peace and security issues is their political exclusion. And I think a lot of the work that we do revolves around certain power dynamics and between different actors, and these are things that we need to address. And structural issues, the ones I've mentioned, structural forms of exclusion. So I think this is maybe one myth that I would want to take away, that it's not something fluffy. It's sometimes very dangerous work, as I said, young people risking their lives around the world to work, to even use the word peace, to speak of peace building. Because it often implies a winner and a loser, and that's already very threatening in itself to many different actors. So yeah, I would want to kind of defluff peace building. I would want it to see, having said that though, I would want us to see it as being part of the everyday. Also in a society as the Netherlands, it's a very relevant topic that we are working on, that we should perhaps be addressing more explicitly as well. Just to give an example, we've had for many, many years a very polarized, or many years, actually only a couple of years, a very polarized debate around the Black Peat, which is a part of a tradition here in the Netherlands around the time of Christmas time, and it's a form of blackface, and it's very, it's really causing a big rift between people. And I think issues like this, or manifestations of polarization in Dutch society, shows that peace building is not, it's a global agenda, it's relevant for people all around the world. And yeah, that's maybe myth 2 that I would want to unravel, or what's the word?
Debunk.
Debunk, thank you. Thank you, Thea.
You're welcome, and thank you very much for the interesting conversation.
You're
really
welcome.
Nice
Thank you for having me here. And yeah, I'm looking at the microphone here, but as I mentioned, really do get in touch with us through our website. And I'm sure GPPAC can also provide you with our contact information.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Peace Corner. If you're interested in hearing more from us, please click subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, or wherever you might be listening. And tune in next time when our communications intern Ben will be talking to Carrie Kennedy about shared security and global conflict trends.